This video is sponsored by IMI. In today's video, we're going to cover a concept called angle shooting. Angle shooting comes from the poker world, where it talks about pushing the rules of the game you're playing to the most extremes, to absolutely going, in some instances, to the absolute furthest the rules allow without breaking them, without cheating, and varying into a place that some people would say is unethical. The examples in today's video, some of them are clear angle shoots, other ones I wouldn't even describe as angle shoots, but often are, so I'm going to approach them from that perspective and talk about them. Something in this video I quite like and think should be part of Magic from a practical standpoint or from a making the game fun standpoint. Some of it I don't like, and there's even one example where I don't think I like it, but at a high level I kind of respect it. I'd love to know what you guys think about the examples in the comment section below, and I'm also going to avoid naming the pros, professionals, or people involved with the examples. Most of them are absolutely fine and probably shouldn't get any hate, but I don't want to make it into that, where people are commenting down below how scummy X or Y was. So I'm going to leave them out, which is a shame in some ways, because one of these is a big bluff that is still a really big Magic player, so, you know, am I not crediting them for their big play? You can just Google it if you're that fascinated by it. But before we get into it, I need to pay my mortgage, so here's a message from today's sponsor. I live quite the busy lifestyle. Between content and a family, I haven't got a lot of spare time, so having a tasty but lean, quick lunch I can whip up is super vital. That's where IMI comes in. Low carb, high protein, and easy to make. Each packet has 21 grams of protein and takes about 7 minutes to rustle up, giving me a delicious, filling lunch without the slump of a brutal food coma. I'm absolutely in love with spicy red miso and tom yum prawn, or shrimp as the Americans would call it. However, I don't have any of those left, so I'm actually not holding up those packets for the eagle-eyed among you. When in a rush, I just go naked with a little bit of fresh cilantro, or if I have more time, I'm piling up some spring onion, king prawns, and boiled egg on top with some sesame seeds in that tasty bowl. Because they're low carb and high fiber and high protein, it means I don't have to feel guilty about having ramen. It's less of a guilty pleasure and more of a sustainable lunch that doesn't give me a massive carb slump. If you want to pick up some IMI noodles today, you can do so by going to imieats.com/Kenobi, or by clicking the link in the description to get 15% off your order. That's imieats.com/Kenobi for 15% off your order. And there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so it's risk-free. Thanks to IMI for sponsoring this video. Let's start with a real simple one, with foil Magic the Gathering cards. When it comes to some foils, old lands, and here I've got some Surge Foil tokens. This is a really funny one. They Surge Foil, which is meant to be a way of stopping things and bending. They Surge Foil at the front and not the back. And the Surge Foil tokens, which are like that from the Commander product for the Warhammer decks, are now warped to shit because they only Surge Foil on one side. If they Surge Foil on both sides, these would be flat as a daisy. I've also got some, the Life of the Goblins here, the wonderful Wizard of Barge here. These have not actually warped. But either way, foils, they warp for different reasons: quality control, humidity in the air. But as you can see here, with some foils and non-foils, the foils have like warped in the middle there to such an extent that they are obviously visible within this pile of Magic cards. In the past, foils have been described as a way of cheating. I've done a video on this channel, I think it's talking about someone who was playing only foil collected companies, so they could see in their deck where their companies were when they were shuffling their deck and setting up their game. In this video, I'm not talking about cheating by playing foils. You can unwarp foils, by the way, for the most part. If you dehumidify them or rehumidify them, or if you compress them in a book, that's what I do. I really push them down and cram them in with cards that aren't foiled and push a book on top of them. Anyway, if you are playing foils, it opens you up for your opponent calling a judge on you to get you checked for things. Now, a judge should be called if you think your opponent is cheating or doing something to get an unfair advantage, but sometimes when an opponent is up against the wall, they will call a judge to check your sleeves, or they will call a judge to check your foils and so on. And this is not cheating as such, but it is trying to use outside influence to get, hopefully, a game loss if some sort of pattern is found or if it looks a little bit suspicious. Now, ultimately, if your foils are not a pattern or it's not looking suspicious, nothing's going to happen. It's just them clambering for a win somehow in a way that's not outside the rules. Of course, I think this is unsporting, so if a player makes a habit of this and a judge notices they're making a habit of it, they may get unsporting conduct allegations or markings too. But I think it's a really interesting thing, because people always talk about how foils can help people to cheat and such, and marked sleeves, damaged sleeves is a thing. You talk about an Arbor was someone who was disqualified for doing that literally. But people don't really talk about the examples that I've been privy to where my sleeves are a little bit old and I've had people call judges to check my sleeves for some sort of pattern of cheating. And then it's realised that, no, I'm not cheating and the opponent's just trying to get an edge by being a dick. This one is one that there is an element of like, sometimes you do want to call your opponent. If your opponent's deck does look like this, then you should be calling a judge because that's legit. But if you just notice that your opponent's playing a couple of foils and you're going to try and pretend there's a pattern there, or pretend that it's for cheating purposes, just to try and get an edge, then you're an angle shooter. It's a weird one based in a real policy of having to deal with this issue where foils can warp and allow people to cut to them in the decks. Figure of Destiny is a famous example of this. It was only available in this extremely bad foil version that people could cut to. Nexus of Fate is another one. Only available, so Figure was available in non-foil, but everyone had the foils from game day or promos or whatever. Nexus was only available in foil and warped, so those had to get replaced at events. That does happen, but I do think it's fascinating that we don't really talk about the other side of it, of people trying to get other people to get game losses by calling judges on shit that doesn't need to be called on. Next up, let's talk about Reality Smasher and an example that I read about years ago. During the time when Oko was legal, let's say there was a devoted druid on one side and a Reality Smasher on the other, and the Reality Smasher is trying to attack a Oko. Reality Smasher has Trample. So in a situation where it attacks into a 0-2, you can declare to put 2 damage onto the 0-2 and 3 damage onto the Reality Smasher, because you only have to apply lethal to the front creature before you roll over into the thing you're attacking, be it a player or a planeswalker. If you don't say this, then it can be assumed that the damage is all being applied to the creature. Now, that's not the case, of course, right? There was a player who actually won via doing this. They kept their Oko alive and didn't let it take the 3 damage from the Reality Smasher by saying, well, you didn't declare that the damage was going over to the Oko, so I assumed it was all going to the devoted druid. This angle shoot here, though within the rules, and though using a default that is assumed that all damage is being dealt to a creature, is bollocks. It's an awful, awful angle shoot that nears on cheating in my opinion, because you are working against the conventional logic of everyone else. You are playing mental gymnastics to get a result that you really want. Anyone watching that situation would assume that the Reality Smasher would smash over the 0-2 and do 3 damage to the Planeswalker beyond. A new player would think that, knowing how the rules work, not how defaults are set within a paper environment away from digital. And also in digital, it automatically defaults to rolling over damage as well. So this one I absolutely hate, and I can't see how anyone could defend this either. I do believe the player who did the 0-2 block and tried to put the damage on that was actually ridiculed and apologised after the fact. I haven't looked up the exact details of the ramifications afterwards for that one. Next up, let's talk about Chalice of the Void and Chalice checking. I have done an entire video on Chalice of the Void and Chalice checking. It's a rambling storytime video about a much more convoluted version of it where someone tried to do it when I was ill, but in essence, Chalice checking works like this. Often the Chalice of the Void will be put on 1. That's how it works in Legacy and most formats like Timeless now and Arena. And you would look to put it on 1 to stop people from playing 1-mana spells. If someone then casts a Brainstorm, there's a trigger from Chalice of the Void that counters the Brainstorm. In Digital Magic, on Arena or Magic the Gathering Online, the trigger automatically goes on the stack and counters the spell. Paper has a unique element to it where there's an acknowledgement that you can't keep track of everything in the Magic game all of the time, and if you had to, and we had to enforce that, it can make the game awkward to enforce if things are missed later. So with triggers like this, if they're your trigger, it's your responsibility to remember them. So your opponent can cast a Brainstorm into your Chalice, and if you don't trigger it and just say, sure, resolves, and forget about your Chalice, for example, they get to cast and resolve their Brainstorm. Many people argue it shouldn't work like this because of how digital Magic works, and I actually have come round to that feeling that Magic in digital and paper should be synonymous. They should be as one. So I do understand, appreciate, and agree with that logic. There is a practical element of it not working within the rules of maintaining the game. Now, I've had Yu-Gi-Oh players explain to me that this is how Yu-Gi-Oh works. All rules must be tracked at all times. In Magic at the moment, how it works is this. If you have a trigger that is yours and is detrimental to you, life loss for example, or your own Chalice trigger when casting your own 1-mana spell, and you miss it, that would be a trigger that then the judge would come along if called and would allow your opponent to decide whether that trigger is put back on the stack. And your opponent's going to say yes, you get the negative one. In the circumstance of a missed trigger that affects your opponent or is not negative or detrimental, the same thing would happen, but your opponent's not going to give it to you. So in the circumstance where you've missed a trigger to counter your opponent's 1-drop spell like a Brainstorm, the judge would put it back on the stack if it's been missed and acknowledged and talked about a turn or so later, and your opponent just be like, no, Brainstorm's resolved. But the negative one is likely to get you what's called a against rule violation or failure to maintain board state or a similar thing. I'm not a judge to describe the difference between the two and the exact intricacies, but failing to do a detrimental trigger to yourself is going to get you penalised in some way because it might look like a pattern that ends up being cheating, of course. The Magic rules as they're currently set up for paper doesn't make your opponent have to maintain all of your triggers. It puts all responsibility on you instead. And to allow games to get on and move on and just work and flow, They don't have this thing they have to go back and reset if a trigger was missed 3 turns ago or similar. I think it allows paper to just function in a way that is practical. I've played a lot of Warhammer at comp level in recent times, and I can imagine Warhammer would benefit from a lot of this sort of stuff as well, a lot of codified rules. Magic has a lot of codified rules, but still have corners for angle shooting as we're discussing today. This one is super interesting because trying to go back and rewind and add things in that someone forgot or missed earlier in a round of Warhammer is similar. So many things change in a game of Magic or Warhammer. Trying to go back and reset things all the time is virtually impossible. The other flip side is you could just have it that if you miss your triggers, you will get warnings regardless. And I do think that that's an option, but I don't like it, and I wonder if that comes from a primal middle ground, like core part of me of playing into Chalice that I've played for 10 plus years, and always assuming Chalice checking was the right thing to do. Hell, I play more Chalice than I play into, so often I'm the one being checked. So this isn't me trying to get that angle shoot middle ground. I respect that allowing people to miss their triggers, allowing people to make the mistake of not utilizing the play pieces that they have in play is a part of the game. I've won games at GPs and similar where my opponent has not triggered something they should have done, and I've not reminded them because it's not my obligation to do so. And I'm playing within the rules there, but I do appreciate why people think it's not as good of a win because that wouldn't have happened in digital, right? Your win rate in digital would be worse. But at the same time, the same rules apply to you. You've got to maintain and track all your triggers too. Is it disparity between digital and paper? It bugs me a little bit, but I feel like it's just needed to make the thing flow and be smooth. Is it an angle shoot? Yes, but it's kind of the angle shoot that I'm okay with. And I know that that's a weird thing to do as well. I know it's weird to say an angle shoot is okay, because some people hate that, but that's where I land on it. For now. You could sway me in the comments. This is Chameleon Colossus. And I want to talk about an example where, this one's an interesting one. So Chameleon Colossus has protection from black. And player A has Chameleon Colossus and enough creatures to attack for lethal, but only if they can't be blocked by our opponents. Let's say I think they might be blue creatures. Player A, the player with the Chameleon Colossus in play, casts Profane Command, a 2 black and X spell with some modes, but mainly it shoots our opponent for 6 life, and it makes 6 creatures gain fear. Now, notice that it's a black spell, and Chameleon Colossus has protection from black, which means that Profane Command is not allowed to target Chameleon Colossus. You cannot target a protection from card with the thing it has protection from. So, dear reader, what does player A do? Well, they dome their opponent for 6 life loss, and they give all legal or all valid targets fear. Chameleon Colossus goes sideways along with a load of other creatures, 5 or 6 other creatures, and the opponent doesn't block any of them because they believe that they can't block Chameleon Colossus because it now has fear. Fear being a keyword that says it can only be blocked by black creatures or artifact creatures. Of course, the Chameleon Colossus was blockable. The opponent, player B, dies, and they died to essentially a bluff. Or, and this is where it gets is an angle shoot. Is that a bluff or is that a miscommunication? There's like up to X targets in naming 5 targets and then one of those targets a second time if it was 6, for example. Instead of just saying all legal targets or all valid targets or whatever, that does leave it open and obfuscate the idea that Chameleon Colossus could have been targeted. Of course it wasn't, and I'm sure player A, if Chameleon Colossus got blocked, they would have been like, yep, sure, you've blocked it. They're not pretending that Chameleon Colossus has it. They're just not telling their opponent that Chameleon Colossus doesn't have it. This one is super interesting because the wording you use is obviously looking to mislead your opponent, but then that's all bluffs, right? This would absolutely get you disqualified in Yu-Gi-Oh! Talking about this with LSV recently. This would get you DQ'd in Yu-Gi-Oh! So is this an angle shoot that should be allowed? I think so. I think at the point that you start to police people's intent and language too harshly, you really remove a lot of the human element of the game. And I think being able to next level your opponent with this is big and fancy and crazy and good. But this example does give me the ick a little bit because it's so towing the line. And that's what angle shooting is. Angle shooting is not just like just fucking with your opponent. And it's not like just off cheating. It's like in this like weird grey area between fucking with your opponent and pushing the rules and cheating. It's in this like, in the layer of fat between. All legal targets is a thing that always makes me laugh when I hear about it. It's one of those old stories. It's old, I think it's like a 14, 15-year example now. I would love to know what people think of this one in the comment section below, because I've not talked about this one on the channel before. It's one that I've always been meaning to make a video about. On that note, I know a few of you are expecting some needle examples in here. There's 2 angle shoot needle examples, pithing needle examples. The reason they're not in this video and you're wondering why they're absent and what you're going to bring up in the comments is that I want to make a whole video discussing the ethics of using pithing needle with like 4 or 5 examples. So that video will be out sometime probably in the new year now. Dryad Arbor, or specifically the From the Vault Dryad Arbor. This one is so crazy, it got a rule changed. This Dryad Arbor is both a creature and a land, but it obviously looks a bit like a forest, and it could have been at some point in the past been put in with your creatures or your lands. And what that means is it can get lost in the weeds as people are stacking and moving their lands around. And that means it might suddenly surprise appear at an opportune time. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't get blown up when you Wrath of God. If you're on plausible creatures, you have to put a Dryad Arbor in the graveyard. If you forget, you've forgotten, but you have failed to maintain board state, and you are essentially lying. If it's in amongst your lands and being shuffled around and tapped and all that sort of stuff, and then later down the line, you're almost dead and you're putting this for a lethal attack, and you pull this random forest out from your pile of lands and be like, oh, my Dryad Arbor is still alive, it'll block. You are obviously purposely hiding your creatures amongst your lands. Now, at one point or another, it was kind of allowed. It no longer is. I do think it's kind of an angle shoot, but if you are hiding things on board underneath cards, it's only an angle shoot and not cheating in the sense that it isn't strictly prohibited by the rules, but the rules have been tightened up. So if it's an angle shoot on the margins of legality, the borders have been pulled in to make this now illegal. Creatures must be in front of lands at Comp REL and higher to allow people to know where the fuck the Dryad Arbor is. I think, technically, this is still legal at lower levels, because where you put stuff on the board isn't really enforced at that level. But I'm pretty sure you will be told off by a judge and given a stern finger wag if you try and hide your From the Vaults Dryad Arbor in amongst your lands in your next game of Legacy or Modern. And now I've got one more missed trigger example with Rest in Peace. A 2-mana white enchantment that when it enters the battlefield it has a trigger and it has an ongoing effect as well. Rest in Peace is synonymous with goodbye graveyards. It ETBs and exiles a graveyard and makes any card, going to graveyard from then on out doesn't die, it just ceases to exist going straight into exile. Now, the interesting thing about this, similar to the Chalice example earlier to an extent, or at least they're in the same family, this might be the cousin of Chalice checking, but worse in my opinion, is that when it enters the battlefield there's a trigger, which means that it only exiles graveyards on the trigger. If you miss your trigger, it doesn't exile graveyards. There is an infamous example where a player lost their sponsorship, if you believe the comments of a Reddit post I read this morning, where that player was playing a graveyard-based deck, and the opponent plays their Rest in Peace, and they go to pick up their graveyard to remove it from the game as the trigger would dictate. And then they realise that the opponent who's played the Rest in Peace hasn't announced the trigger, so they put their graveyard back. The turn gets passed, and when the Rest in Peace player says, why is your graveyard still there? The graveyard owning player says, well, you forgot the trigger. Now, a judge is called, and in an interesting twist of the whole story, the judge sides with you didn't announce your trigger. The graveyard player gets to keep their graveyard where it is. Now, the judges are right there because they don't know one important detail. The graveyard player picked up their graveyard, basically signifying with an action that they were enacting what every fucking player knows Rest in Peace does. And then when they didn't hear the trigger, they realized they could put it back down and go for an angle shoot. Now, not announcing the trigger is a thing that you can probably gotcha someone on. I think it's incredibly scummy. It's not cheating as such, but I think it's incredibly scummy and incredibly dumb. If a player tried to really get me on that, I do think they are trying to fucking beat me with legalese rather than the actual magic cards or our own skills as players. And I think that was really dumb. I look down upon them hugely. What makes it worse in this circumstance? I think missing the trigger is a thing that can happen. So when you play your graveyard, Rest in Peace, you need to say out loud, let's exile our graveyards, or point to their graveyards as gone, or whatever. Make sure you do that. But the fact that he picked up his graveyard, which is like a physical inaction of it, like if the judge had known that, I'm sure they would have ruled in the other favour. And I think it was after the fact that another player did this got absolutely destroyed in the comments of Reddit and the social media posts on Twitter and lost the sponsorship according to those comments years later that I'm reading. But this is a fascinating bit of angle shooting because it's true. You can miss the trigger on Rest in Peace. I think it's stupid if you try to push for that, but you can. This player went to enact the trigger themselves though. They almost like said to their opponent, yeah, I got you fam. And because there was no verbal trigger, they went to reset their graveyard. Scummy as shit. So that's 6 examples of angle shooting. Some I agree with, some I don't. Some are weird and intricate. One ended up having a rules change where you hide your FTV Dryad Arbor and now you can't. If there was an angle shooting thing, or I think that's borderline cheating but isn't quite, and I didn't include in this video, let me know in the conversation below. I might include it in the next ones. And the needle, the pithy needle examples, talk about them in the comments if you want to, but I'm going to cover that all in more detail in a future video. I've been Vince, also known as PleasantKenobi on the internet. If you're looking to check out this week's sponsor, check out the link in the description below, and I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.